Hi, I'm Clara, and the memory of that Christmas Eve is still sharp enough to cut. The house smelled like cinnamon and pine. The tree lights blinked in a lazy rhythm. Plates clinked. Laughter rose and fell like a tide. I had spent the afternoon baking, the kind of cookies that crackle at the edges and smell like childhood. I wanted the night to be simple. Family, food, a few carols. My stepmother, Diane, loved bigger stages. She loved being seen. She wore a red dress that caught the light and a smile that had been practiced in mirrors. Diane had slid into our lives after my mother died, and at first she seemed like a balm. Organized, attentive, always offering to help with the small things grief makes heavy. But warmth can be a mask. Over time, her help became control. She rearranged photos on the mantel, moved my father's mail, and learned the cadence of his days. She learned how to make decisions for him and how to make those decisions look like kindness. The living room was full. Cousins, aunts, neighbors, people who had known us for years. My father, Robert, sat in his favorite chair, humming along to the piano. I was carrying a tray of cookies when Diane stood up. She had that posture that says, "I have something important to say." She cleared her throat and, with the kind of loudness that makes strangers lean in, announced, "Before we sing, I think everyone should know that Clara has been living off this family for years. She owes us money." The room tilted. Conversations stopped mid-sentence. A child's eyes widened. My father's face went blank. I felt the heat rush to my face like a physical thing, a tide of shame. My hands shook so badly, I nearly dropped the tray. The cookies rattled like tiny alarm bells. Diane continued, voice syrupy. "We've covered her rent, her car, and even her credit card bills. It's time she paid us back." She smiled at the room as if she'd told a charming anecdote. People glanced at me, then at my father, then back at her. The piano's melody faltered. I remember the sensations in detail because they anchored me. The metallic taste at the back of my throat. The way my breath came shallow and fast. The small, hot prickles behind my eyes. I wanted to speak. I wanted to tell them the truth, that I'd worked 2 jobs, that I'd paid my rent, that the only time I'd accepted help was when my father insisted after the funeral. But the words lodged like stones. My father tried to speak. "Diane, that's not." She cut him off with a look that said she'd rehearsed this. "Robert, I'm just being honest. People should know where their money goes." She turned to the family as if the whole room were her audience. The humiliation was not just the accusation. It was the performance. Diane had chosen the most public moment she could find to make me small. The rest of the night was a blur of polite questions and awkward silences. People who had known me for years asked tentative things. My cousin's smile was thin. My aunt's eyes flicked away. The carols resumed, but the warmth had gone out of them. That night I lay awake and replayed the scene until it became a loop. The humiliation hardened into a new kind of clarity. Shame has a way of focusing you. It makes you notice details you'd ignored. I started to watch Diane the way you watch a clock, for small, telling movements. She logged into my father's email when he left the room. She took calls in the study and closed the door. Receipts appeared in the trash. My father's checkbook moved. I tried to talk to him. He would start, then stop like a man walking through fog. Diane was always nearby, with a hand on his arm and a look that said, "Let me handle this." She began to control the narrative. Small comments to neighbors, offhand remarks about helping me, hints that I was irresponsible. The humiliation spread like a stain. But humiliation can also be a teacher. It taught me to document. I printed pay stubs, saved emails, and asked my landlord for a written statement confirming my rent history. I made a folder labeled proof and kept it in a locked drawer at work. I emailed copies to myself with timestamps. Each piece of paper felt like a small reclaiming of dignity. This section ends with the wound still raw, but with a new, quiet determination forming. The Christmas accusation was the spark. The rest of the story would be about how I turned that spark into a controlled, deliberate flame. After Christmas, I stopped reacting and started collecting. Anger is loud. Strategy is quiet. I learned to let the evidence do the talking. First, I secured my own foundation. I printed every pay stub, every bank transfer, every lease renewal. I asked my landlord for a written statement confirming my rent history. He obliged, surprised and sympathetic. I saved emails from my boss and screenshots of direct deposits. Each document was a brick. Then I turned to my father's finances, gently, respectfully, and with his permission when possible. Diane had been managing a lot of his affairs. She would say, "I'll take care of it," and then the bills would be paid in ways that didn't add up. I started to notice patterns: small withdrawals labeled household expenses, larger transfers to a company name I didn't recognize, receipts for home repairs that never happened. There were setbacks. Once I confronted Diane indirectly by asking my father about a check I'd found in the trash. He shrugged and said, "I must have written it for something." Diane smiled, and the conversation died. Another time, I thought I'd found a smoking gun, a transfer to a shell company, but the bank's automated message called it a routine transfer. I learned to expect dead ends. So, I changed tactics. I consulted a lawyer. Not to sue, not yet, but to understand what constituted elder financial abuse and what evidence would be persuasive. The lawyer listened, asked questions, and then said, "If you can show a pattern of unauthorized transfers or forged documents, that's actionable. But you'll need records." Armed with that, I became meticulous. I requested copies of any documents Diane had signed in my father's name. I asked the bank for a ledger of transfers, not as an accusation, but as a concerned daughter helping her father organize his finances. The bank, bound by privacy, wouldn't give me everything, but they did provide some information after my father signed a release. He was hesitant, but when I explained I just wanted to help, he agreed. What we found was a pattern. Small transfers at first, $200 here, $300 there, labeled as household expenses. Then larger sums labeled as consulting fees to a company I'd never heard of. Jewelry purchases. Travel charges. Receipts for services that never happened. The numbers added up. The pattern looked like someone slowly siphoning funds under the guise of care. I also found a document that looked like my father's signature on a power of attorney form, dated 6 months earlier. The signature was shaky and didn't match his usual script. I took it to a handwriting expert recommended by the lawyer. The expert called it suspicious and suggested further analysis. It wasn't proof yet, but it was a direction. While the legal and financial work moved forward, I worked on the emotional side of the plan. Diane had humiliated me at Christmas because she wanted an audience. I decided to give her one, but on my terms. I planned a family gathering for a spring holiday, inviting the same relatives who had heard her accusation. I told them it would be casual. I didn't tell them the plan. I wanted their reactions to be genuine. Behind the scenes, I coordinated with the lawyer. We prepared a letter outlining the suspicious transfers and requesting an explanation. We arranged for a bank representative to be on standby, ready to confirm account freezes if the evidence warranted it. I rehearsed what I would say, short sentences for tension, long descriptive beats for drama. I practiced breathing slowly, speaking clearly, and letting silence be a tool. Silence makes people fill the space with their own guilt. There were moments of doubt. I worried about my father's pride, about dragging family matters into the open. I worried about being seen as petty. I worried about what would happen if the evidence wasn't enough. But every time doubt crept in, I thought of that Christmas. Diane's smile as she announced my debt. The way strangers had looked at me. That memory hardened into resolve. The slow accumulation of proof had turned my anger into a tool. I wasn't seeking revenge for revenge's sake. I wanted to stop the slow theft of my father's life and to restore his dignity. The plan was set. The next step was execution. The day I chose felt ordinary. Sunlight through the curtains, the smell of coffee, the soft clink of plates. We gathered at my parents' house for a casual family lunch. Diane arrived in a floral dress, her smile polished. She moved through the room like a hostess, arranging napkins, offering wine. My father sat quietly, his hands folded. The relatives who had been at Christmas were there, cousins, aunts, neighbors. The air was warm with small talk. Halfway through the meal, Diane cleared her throat. I just want to say how grateful I am for this family, she said, voice bright. It's been a pleasure to help keep things running. Her eyes flicked to me. And I hope everyone understands that sometimes family members need support. We've been generous. I stood up. The room quieted because standing up in a room full of people is an act that draws attention. I held the folder in my hands like a shield. It was the same folder I'd kept at work, pay stubs, bank statements, the handwriting expert's notes. Each page was a small victory. Before we go further, I said, voice steady, I want to read something. I opened the folder and pulled out the lawyer's letter. I read it slowly, letting each word land. I described the transfers we'd found, the suspicious consulting fees, the credit card charges for jewelry and travel, and the power of attorney with a shaky signature. I watched Diane's face as I spoke. At first, she smiled the way someone smiles when they think they're still in control. Then the smile faltered. When I finished, I said, I asked the bank to review these transactions. They've placed a temporary freeze on any transfers pending investigation. I had coordinated this with the bank earlier. They were ready to confirm if needed. I reached into my pocket and dialed the number I'd been given, the bank's fraud department. The room leaned in because the sound of a phone call in a quiet dining room is like a drumbeat. Hello, this is Clara Hayes, I said, and then I handed the phone to my father. He listened, his face changing color as the bank representative confirmed the freeze and explained that an investigation had been opened into several transfers linked to Diane's accounts and to a company she'd used. The representative read a short, formal statement. Accounts frozen. Investigation underway. Please refrain from contacting the bank for further details. The silence that followed was heavy. Diane's mouth opened and closed like a fish. She stood up, voice sharp. This is ridiculous. You have no right to. My father, who had been quiet for months, finally spoke. His voice was small but clear. Diane, is this true? Did you? She stammered, tried to laugh, but the laugh sounded brittle. Then, as if the scene needed a final, undeniable note, the handwriting expert, who had agreed to be available, walked in. He had a copy of the preliminary report and a list of the transfers. He read aloud the parts that mattered, the pattern, the dates, the inconsistencies. He said plainly, we have reason to believe there may have been unauthorized transfers and possibly forged documents. We recommend you cooperate with the investigation. Diane's face went from pale to red to a stunned white. She tried to speak, to accuse, to deflect, but the words fell flat. The relatives who had once nodded politely now looked at her with something like betrayal. My cousin's jaw tightened. My aunt's eyes filled. The carols from that Christmas, the memory of them, felt like a distant echo. Now, silence was the sweetest music. The most satisfying moment wasn't a dramatic confession. It was the small, human unraveling, the way Diane's practiced composure cracked, the way her eyes darted for an escape route, the way she finally sat down as if the chair could hold her. She had wanted an audience when she bragged about my debt. Now she had one when the truth came out. The room was silent in a way that felt like justice. After the initial shock, practical things followed. The bank took statements. The police took a report. The handwriting expert confirmed that the signature on the power of attorney was inconsistent with my father's usual writing. Diane was asked to leave the house while the investigation proceeded. My father, who had been adrift, looked at me with a mixture of shame and gratitude. He took my hand and said, I'm so sorry I didn't see it. I didn't feel triumphant in the way I'd imagined. There was relief, a deep, physical exhale that felt like a lung filling after being underwater. There was also sorrow. I thought about the years my father had lost to manipulation, the quiet moments he'd given away. I thought about Diane's smile and how practiced cruelty can be. I thought about the neighbors who'd been complicit through silence. In the weeks that followed, the investigation unfolded. Diane's accounts were scrutinized. The shell company she'd used for consulting was traced. There were hearings and a slow, bureaucratic unspooling of a life built on small deceptions. My father worked with the lawyer to reverse transfers where possible. He began to reclaim small things, paying his own bills, making his own appointments, sitting in his favorite chair without someone else's hand on the armrest. For me, the aftermath was a lesson in the cost of truth. Justice had been served in a way that felt fair. The bank froze accounts, the law took its course, but the emotional work was ongoing. My father and I rebuilt trust slowly. We had long conversations about boundaries and pride, and the ways grief can make people vulnerable. He apologized more than once, and I forgave him more than once. Forgiveness didn't erase the past, but it made room for a future. I also learned something about myself. The humiliation that had once felt like a wound became a catalyst. I discovered a capacity for patience and strategy one hadn't known I had. I learned that power can be quiet and methodical, not loud and vengeful. The most satisfying revenge is the one that restores balance without destroying the people you love. Sometimes justice is loud. Sometimes it's a quiet phone call that makes a room go still. If you've ever been underestimated or shamed, remember, evidence and patience are powerful allies. If this story gave you chills, smash that like button and tell us in the comments, what's the most satisfying revenge you've ever witnessed? And, of course, subscribe for more faceless stories of betrayal and payback. I'm Clara, and I'll see you next time.